There's a curse, they say, meant only for the overly ambitious. Not cast by witches, not whispered by demons, but a living curse born from the earth carried on, the wind passed down through the voices of those trampled beneath the hooves of conquest. George Armstrong Custer didn't believe in curses, he laughed at them. A golden war hero with flowing blonde hair and a face fit for the stage, he had won glory in Virginia's blood-soaked fields and was adored by a nation eager for legends. Then he turned west. He thought he was writing America's final epic, where proud, native warriors would kneel beneath the sword of civilization. But what waited for him in the valley of the Little Bighorn was no triumph, no applause. It was an ancient reckoning, brutal, unforgiving. No one was supposed to tell the full truth about that day, not in history books, not in classrooms. Because if you knew what really happened to Custer and to the men who followed him, the story of America, you think you know, would begin to crack. And behind the curtain of heroic sacrifice lies a nightmare buried for nearly 150 years. America in the 1870s was a nation ravenous and conflicted. The Civil War had ended barely a decade earlier, leaving behind not peace, but scars, both physical and ideological. Reconstruction had fractured politics. The South simmered with resentment. The North, triumphant yet weary, turned its gaze westward to new promises and new enemies. The Great Plains stretched endlessly, a sea of grass, bison, and sky. But for settlers and the expanding railroad tycoons, it was not freedom. They saw it was real estate. The native tribes who had lived there for centuries were now obstacles to be removed, assimilated, or destroyed. The U.S. government, eager to connect the coasts and control resources, struck treaties, then broke them, again and again. Words on paper meant little when gold was discovered, when railroads were threatened, when the land itself whispered wealth. In Washington, policy hardened. Native resistance would not be tolerated. The great Sioux Nation, comprising the Lakota Northern Cheyenne and Arapaho, stood directly in the way of that ambition. They were proud, mobile, and fiercely protective of their lands, especially the sacred Black Hills. When gold was discovered there in 1874 during an expedition led ironically by George Custer himself, the government turned its back on existing treaties. Prospectors flooded in. Tensions erupted. War was inevitable. And in the middle of this volatile chessboard stood Custer. He was not born a hero. In fact, he was nearly expelled from West Point, graduating last in his class. Reckless, flamboyant, insubordinate. But in war, those qualities translated into daring and flair. During the Civil War, he rose quickly, his bravery undeniable, his charm irresistible. Newspapers adored him, commanders tolerated him. By the war's end, he was one of the youngest generals in Union history. But after the war, glory was harder to find. The military shrank. His rank dropped. The eastern cities moved on to peace and politics. Custer, restless and addicted to recognition, found himself stationed on the far edges of empire, sent west to fight a war few Americans understood and even fewer cared about. Still, he thrived in the West. The open plains, the colorful dispatches he sent to newspapers, the romanticism of cavalry charges against painted warriors, all fed the myth he carefully constructed around himself. He dressed like no other officer. Tight gloves, velvet jackets, red neckerchiefs. He brought a band to play music on campaign. He invited journalists to witness his movements. To many Americans, Custer wasn't just a soldier. He was the frontier incarnate, daring, dazzling, and destined for greatness. But beneath the showmanship was a man haunted by irrelevance. His political ambitions had stalled. His finances were unstable. And in 1876, the nation's centennial year, he saw a chance to reclaim the spotlight. Orders came from President Grant's administration force the hostile tribes onto reservations by any means necessary. 3 columns would move into Sioux territory and crush resistance. Custer, commanding the 7th Cavalry, would lead the most daring strike deep into enemy land. He believed it would be quick, decisive, victorious. He believed wrong. Custer's arrogance was not just personal, it was systemic. Washington underestimated native coordination. They believed Sitting Bull and Crazy Horse would scatter like deer before rifles. They did not grasp the spiritual and political unity forming among the tribes, nor the scale of the native encampment hidden near the Little Bighorn River. But some did try to warn him. Custer's own native scouts, Arikara and Crow, reported massive numbers. Smoke signals, fresh tracks, evidence of a force larger than anything they'd seen before. Custer ignored them. This wasn't just about tactics. This was about legacy. If he struck first, alone without waiting for reinforcements, he would win the glory, the headlines, perhaps even the presidency someday. He was playing not just for the battle, but for history itself. And so, on a sweltering June morning in Montana Territory, Custer divided his regiment into 3 detachments and rode straight into the valley. What he didn't know was this: he wasn't marching toward victory. He was marching into the largest native alliance the plains had ever seen. And they were ready. June 22, 1876. The sun rose hard over the rolling Montana plains, burning through morning mist like a knife. George Armstrong Custer sat astride his horse, staring out into the vast emptiness. Behind him, the men of the 7th Cavalry 12 companies, strong tightened straps, loaded rifles, and swallowed nerves. They had no idea they were riding into a storm. The scent of ambition hung heavier than the dust. This wasn't just a mission. For Custer, it was redemption. His name had faded from headlines. Washington elites whispered that he was washed up, unstable, even dangerous. Just weeks earlier, he'd been reprimanded for testifying against President Grant's brother in a corruption scandal. His career teetered on a knife's edge. He needed this, not just to win, but to matter again. So when warnings came, he ignored them. Crow and Arikara scouts had seen the signs: enormous trails leading into the valley, circling birds that hinted at massive campfires, strange movements in the hills. They pleaded with Custer to wait for reinforcements from General Terry and Colonel Gibbon, still days behind. But Custer wouldn't hear it. He believed the natives would flee once confronted, scatter like wild dogs. He'd heard the same underestimations in every officer's tent from Kansas to the Dakotas. He believed them because he wanted to. 3 columns had been organized for the campaign against the Lakota and their allies. Custer's was the fastest. He knew if he reached the target first, the glory would be his alone. So he pushed forward with relentless speed, forcing his men through heat, exhaustion, and hunger. 24 hours of marching, with barely any rest. Horses were collapsing, tempers were flaring, but still they advanced. Then came the smoke. On June 25th, in the early afternoon, his scouts climbed a bluff and saw it, thick plumes rising from a hidden valley just beyond the ridgeline. The native village. But not just any village. A city of teepees. The Arikara and Crow had never seen anything like it. Thousands of horses, lines of teepees stretching far into the distance. This wasn't a nomadic camp, it was a gathering, a spiritual alliance. Warriors from all over Lakota, Cheyenne, Arapaho had come to answer Sitting Bull's vision. In a powerful sundance just days before the Lakota leader had seen soldiers falling into his camp like grasshoppers from the sky. It was a prophecy they believed, and one they were prepared to fulfill. Custer stood at the edge of that ridgeline and made the fatal choice. He divided his forces. Major Marcus Reno would lead 3 companies to attack the village from the south. Captain Frederick Benteen would scout the bluffs to the west. Custer himself, with 5 companies, about 210 men, would circle around and strike from the north, driving the enemy into disarray. What he didn't know was that there were more than 2,000 warriors in that valley, many armed with modern Winchester rifles, and all ready for war. At around 3 p.m., Reno charged. But instead of panic, he met resistance. Dozens, then hundreds of warriors surged out of the village. Reno's men fired, but they were outnumbered and exposed. Panic set in. They broke formation, retreated into the woods, then fled across the river in chaos. Some drowned. Some were gunned down. Reno himself lost control, his mind unraveling as he watched his command collapse. By the time he reached the bluffs above, more than 40 of his men were dead, and there was no sign of Custer. Meanwhile, Custer was moving into a trap. He had crossed the river further north, approaching the village from the opposite side. He still believed he was attacking a scattering enemy, not a concentrated force of warriors enraged by generations of betrayal, massacre, and loss. He reached a ridge called Medicine Tail Coulee and ordered his men forward. The warriors saw him coming. From every direction they rose. They came on horseback, painted in ash and blood, war cries rising like thunder. Crazy Horse led the charge, bare-chested, fearless, a whirlwind of fury. Bullets whizzed past him, but he rode straight into the gunfire. The momentum was seismic. The hills themselves seemed to roar. Custer's men fired volley after volley, but it wasn't enough. Their single-shot Springfield carbines were no match for the faster repeating Winchesters. Within minutes, they were surrounded. At Last Stand Hill, the soldiers formed a tight circle. Horses were shot to the ground to form barricades. Men reloaded with trembling hands, sweat dripping into their eyes, smoke choking their lungs. Custer moved among them, yelling orders. But it was chaos. Witnesses from the native side would later recall the screaming, the terror, and then the silence. One by one, the soldiers fell. Many shot, some bludgeoned, some tried to run only to be cut down instantly. There were no survivors. In less than an hour, Custer and his entire command were wiped out. But death was not the end. The mutilations began not out of barbarity, as propaganda would claim, but out of ceremony. Among some Plains tribes, it was believed that disfiguring a body kept the soul from returning to harm the living. Eyes were removed so the dead could not find their way back. Ears were pierced, fingers cut, the heart taken. Custer's own body was found stripped, riddled with bullets. His chest opened, his face, strangely, left untouched. Some say it was out of respect. Others believe the silence was part of a larger myth. Either way, his body lay cold among the 210 others, scattered in the grass, watched over only by the wind and the crows. Back on the bluffs, Reno and Benteen waited. They heard the distant gunfire. They saw smoke curling above the hills. But no messenger arrived, no sound from Custer's side. Then nothing. The night fell, and the realization set in. Custer wasn't coming back. They hunkered down, surrounded low on water and hope. The shooting returned the next morning, brief but deadly. Then, as quickly as they had come, the warriors vanished, melting back into the plains, taking with them their wounded and their dead. When reinforcements finally arrived days later, what they found was a graveyard. The bodies were bloated in the summer heat. Birds circled, horses lay twisted. The names of the dead were etched into blood-soaked earth: Keogh, Calhoun, Crittenden, Custer. A full detachment of America's finest cavalry annihilated. And the myth of Custer the Golden Boy was shattered in a single afternoon. But something stranger happened in the aftermath, something even more disturbing than the slaughter itself. The truth was buried. When the smoke cleared, the dead were still warm. The summer sun pressed down with cruel indifference as scavenger birds circled, descending without hesitation. Bodies were everywhere, twisted in poses of desperation, hands frozen mid-reach, mouths open as if still screaming. Some had been scalped, others mutilated in ways so precise, so ritualistic that even the hardened soldiers who arrived later struggled to describe what they saw. There was no orderly line of fallen warriors, no disciplined ranks. Just scattered ruin, a chaotic tapestry of destruction, burned into the dirt and grass of the Little Bighorn forever. Custer's last stand had ended, not with a bang, but a slow, choking silence. And he was just one among the dead. His body was found 2 days after the massacre, naked, stripped of his boots, weapons, and uniform. 2 bullet wounds marked his chest and temple, both possibly fatal. But what disturbed the burial team most wasn't the death itself. It was the ritual. His chest had been opened. Some reports said his heart had been taken. Others said his fingers had been severed. His scalp curiously remained untouched. Some believed it was out of awe. Others whispered it was because they had something darker planned for it later. His eyes, according to one survivor of the burial detail, were gone. They claimed it was part of a spiritual custom to blind a warrior's soul to keep it from seeking vengeance in the afterlife. But among the soldiers it was read differently. It wasn't just death. It was desecration. One man, Lieutenant James Bradley, wrote in his journal that the field reeked not of just decay, but of judgment. He described a horse's skull crushed beneath a boot, the flies already thick over the lips of a young trooper, whose face had been peeled back like parchment. Another was found holding a photograph of a woman melted from the sun, fused to his chest by blood. And Custer's brother Thomas was unrecognizable. His face had been obliterated. The only way they could identify him was from a tattoo on his forearm, a heart, and the letters TWC. But beyond the physical wounds was something harder to look at: the absolute absence of hope. The men who had fought alongside Custer had died, knowing no help would come. No bugle, no flags, no final charge. Just the endless sound of hooves and gunfire, the whooping cries of warriors surrounding them, and the creeping understanding that they had walked willingly into their own execution. Major Reno, still alive, couldn't face the field. He stayed on the bluffs, his nerves frayed to the edge. He was later accused of cowardice, even drunkenness. Some said he hid in a ravine during the battle. Others claimed he'd lost control of his senses entirely. What no one denied was that he hadn't gone down to help, and the U.S. Army, when they finally arrived, did not declare a noble defeat. They issued silence. No official investigation was launched. No inquiry into Custer's decision to divide his forces, to ignore intelligence, to charge an unknown enemy with inferior numbers, and no reinforcements. The press mourned him, yes. Statues went up. Memorials. Paintings of Custer's last stand depicted him with saber, drawn surrounded by savages brave to the bitter end. But those were lies, artistic rewrites, history polished until it gleamed. The real end had been filth, blood, and terror. One soldier from Terry's relief column described the battlefield as a butcher's pen, and then never spoke of it again. The native side was equally haunted. Though victorious, many warriors later refused to describe what happened. Some considered it sacred, others simply too painful. The death of so many white and native alike had scorched the land, and they knew what would follow: revenge. Indeed, it came swiftly. The U.S. government, humiliated, abandoned all pretense of negotiation. Massive reinforcements swept across the plains. Villages were burned. Bison slaughtered in the millions to starve out resisting tribes. The warpath turned into a campaign of total erasure. By the next year, Crazy Horse would be dead, stabbed in the back while under arrest. Sitting Bull, years later, would be killed during a botched arrest on the Standing Rock Reservation. The alliance that had stood together at Little Bighorn was crushed beneath the machinery of vengeance. But what of the public? What of the ordinary Americans reading newspaper accounts? They were fed a myth. That Custer had been betrayed. That he'd been ambushed. That the native warriors were inhuman, bloodthirsty monsters who desecrated the dead without reason. No one published the voices of the Arikara scouts. No one printed the warnings Custer had ignored. The few survivors from Reno's and Benteen's units were silenced by shame, fear, or orders. The truth was rewritten, made safe, sanitized. But in private journals, letters, and oral histories, pieces of the truth survived. 1. Arikara Scout. White man runs him, later spoke through an interpreter. I told him. We all told him. There were too many. They would not run. They would fight. But he smiled. He said it was his fight. Another Curly, one of the few Crow Scouts who escaped the battle, described seeing Custer riding ahead, refusing to listen, refusing to slow. He called it suicide with a flag. And still, decades later, the myth endured. In paintings, Custer was always clean, sword in hand, eyes clear, jaw set. He was forever the gallant knight, not the desperate, miscalculating officer who led hundreds to a pointless death. But the ground remembered. Even today, if you walk the hills of the Little Bighorn battlefield, you'll find white marble markers where bodies were found, scattered, uneven. Silent witnesses to the chaos of that day. One marker alone on a slope reads simply, Lieutenant General George A. Custer fell here. Nothing more. No rank, no glory, just absence. There are no grand speeches carved into the stone, no triumphant quotes, just the wind and the memory of a man who believed he could not fall until the earth swallowed him whole. The battlefield was quiet. The blood had dried. The bodies were buried beneath thin soil and marble markers. But the story was far from over. In the months after Little Bighorn, the United States did not pause to mourn. It mobilized. Fueled by rage and humiliation, it unleashed one of the most aggressive military campaigns in its history. The Lakota, Cheyenne, and Arapaho were relentlessly pursued. Entire villages were destroyed. Women and children captured. Food stores burned. This wasn't a war anymore. It was a purge. The lesson wasn't about caution. It wasn't about listening to native scouts or questioning arrogance. The lesson was punish them all. The Black Hills promised by treaty to the Lakota were seized outright. Gold mines were opened. Railroads pushed deeper. Tribes were pushed farther west onto reservations that shrank with each passing decade. By 1890, the last embers of resistance were extinguished at Wounded Knee, where hundreds of unarmed Lakota, including women and children, were gunned down in the snow. Custer was long dead by then, but the myth of Custer had grown louder than ever. In paintings, he became immortal, caught in a moment of impossible valor, surrounded by swarms of enemies, his saber gleaming under the western sun. He was no longer a failed commander. He was a martyr, a symbol of noble sacrifice, a face that children would one day memorize in textbooks, but never understand. Because what was erased from the official story were the warnings, the division of forces, the thousands of Native men, women, and children who fought not to conquer but to survive. What was buried was the truth of empire, that Custer died not defending civilization, but enforcing its greed. There were voices who tried to speak up. Native elders passed down oral histories, detailed accounts of the battle, of what led to it and what followed. They named the scouts who tried to stop it. They remembered the ceremonies, the dreams, the visions. Sitting Bull's prophecy, Crazy Horse's charge. The moment Custer realized too late that he'd been wrong. But those voices weren't given microphones. Historians in the 20th century, especially post-World War II, began to challenge the old narrative. They pointed to diaries, military dispatches, reports that had been buried or overlooked. They questioned how a so-called genius could walk 210 men into one of the most lopsided defeats in American military history. They scrutinized the propaganda that painted Native resistance as savagery and Custer's ambition as heroism. Still, the myth was hard to kill. In 1941, Hollywood released They Died with Their Boots on Errol. Flynn played Custer as a dashing martyr. The real story, the silence, the mutilations, the ignored warnings, was nowhere to be found. It wasn't until the late 20th and early 21st centuries that Little Bighorn began to be told more honestly. Scholars, tribal historians, and activists began to reframe the event not as a last stand, but as a moment of Native victory. A rare triumph, however brief, against a machine designed to erase them. And even now, the land remembers. The Little Bighorn Battlefield. National Monument, once called Custer Battlefield, was renamed in 1991. A new memorial dedicated to the native warriors who fought and died there was finally erected alongside the older one. It's quiet, made of stone and steel, carved with the names of those long ignored by official memory. Crazy Horse, Gaul, Lame White Man, Rain in the Face. They too were leaders. They too had stories. And, for the first time, they were allowed to share the ground with the man whose legend once tried to erase them, not as enemies, but as part of the same bloody history. A history still reckoning with its ghosts. So now you know. Custer didn't go down swinging with glory in his eyes. He didn't fall a martyr or a military genius. He died chasing a myth and became one himself. Not because of what he did, but because of what we were told to remember. But stories like this don't end in the dirt. They echo, in the silence of forgotten treaties, in the wind over the Black Hills, in the eyes of descendants still carrying the weight of broken promises. And if you think this was dark, wait until you hear what happened to Sitting Bull. Betrayed by his own, shot in the back during a pre-dawn raid. A warrior who outlived Custer, only to be murdered in handcuffs by the very system he once defied. Click here to uncover that next chapter, one even more twisted than this. And if you want the truth, most textbooks won't tell you you're in the right place. Subscribe. Stay curious. Because what's buried in the past doesn't always stay there.